The present time, southeastern Nigeria, a land where the sun rises over hills and valleys while the echoes of historical tensions ripple through towns and villages. Here,
Northern Nigeria against foreign strikes on terrorist targets. Patterns
safe
you can see the tension.
In this context, a figure has emerged at the center of public debate.
The courtroom disruptions remain unresolved in the minds of citizens when power appears one-sided. Requires facts,
this is a story of tension,
not
uncertainty,
assumptions.
search for security, and a complex intersection between non-state armed forces, the state, and civil society. The story begins with the growing activity of the Eastern Security
comment
Network,
section,
known by its acronym
but
ESN,
keep it
born amid perceptions of state
and
neglect and repeated
factual.
attacks on southeastern communities. The ESN
If election results are rejected before voting,
protect the Igbo population
even
from violence perpetrated by armed groups operating outside the law. However, the security dynamics in Nigeria are historically complex,
at a moment
shaped by
that
ethnic
could
rivalry,
shape
territorial
your
disputes, and
future,
structural marginalization.
and then
In this environment,
struggling
the
to be
definitions of
heard.
protection and threat become
For
blurred,
Kanu's
subject to interpretation and political manipulation. What is defense for some is an armed escalation for others. Chizoram Udele emerges in this scenario as
this
a polarizing
simply
figure.
political
For some,
tension,
protector.
or
others,
should there
another
be
actor on
more
the board where
public
interests may be far from the well-being
clarification
of
to
civilians?
calm
Public attention on it
concerns?
intensified as unverified reports began circulating about a coordinated security operation in an area referred to as Mother's Valley,
But
a region
because
emblematic
of
of geography
who
and
he
emotional weight it
is.
holds for local communities. According to these
Pause.
reports, Nigerian
Let
security
that
forces,
to be
operatives from the Department of State
recognized,
Services (DSS),
not
militias
because
with fierce
of
reputations, and
rigging,
local vigilante groups had
not
increased their presence
because
in
of
areas
violence.
considered ESN strongholds. These actions, as described by voices in the communities, were allegedly aimed at dismantling what is seen as a threat to national security. However, the focus on ESN activities has sparked a broader discussion. Why? Many Igbo citizens ask, did these operations not occur with the same intensity when groups like the Fani, militants responsible for violent attacks before the full
Dress
formation of the
before the
ESN,
court.
struck defenseless communities?
For
This
those who
question
may
is
not
merely rhetorical.
understand,
It exposes
a
a wound and
final
distrust between civilians and state
these
institutions.
were not
For many,
outside
the perceived
rumors.
neglect during those
They
critical periods
occurred
planted seeds of doubt
during the
about the government's
session
willingness
in
and capacity
open
to protect all citizens equally. The rise of
final
Udele and his team
reflection.
within ESN cannot be understood
Whether you
without this backdrop.
people begin
Communities
to
that witness
question
children,
the
siblings,
idea
neighbors
of
falling victim
one
to attacks,
Nigeria,
real state response began to
not
organize.
because
The ESN consolidated as a response to what they described as an existential threat. But when an armed group assumes such a visible role in security, the dilemma
in
inevitably
any
emerges.
democratic
To what extent does
society,
protection become armed rivalry?
at the
Where
same
does
time,
defense end and militarization of social space begin? These questions have divided opinions both within and outside Igbo society. The tactics employed by the ESN and other armed groups have had tangible impacts on daily life. Some areas have experienced a temporary sense of order where state presence was minimal, although the security provided by non-state actors is always fragile, volatile, and legally ambiguous. Allegations of abuses, intimidation, and collateral violence have accompanied these dynamics. The line between community protection and arbitrary use
according
of force,
to his
endless
legal
note,
team,
is too often blurred.
Kanu
This has
was
sparked concern
not
among sectors of
allowed to
society that
deliver
any
his
armed group
final
operating outside state
written
control as a potential risk to long-term stability. The federal government, for its part, has responded with a combination of security operations and public statements aimed at reaffirming state authority. Intelligence agencies and riot control units have intensified movements in several southeastern
leader
regions.
of
DSS officials have
indigenous
stated in official
peoples of
communications that their
Biafra.
mandate is to safeguard territorial integrity
What
and combat
happened
any
in
group
court?
that operates outside the state's
Northern
monopoly on violence,
Nigeria
as established by the
against
Nigerian
foreign
Constitution.
strikes on
Nevertheless, these
terrorist
actions are perceived by
targets.
many as selective or reactive,
Patterns
seemingly
ready,
more
you
focused on
can
dismantling
see
the
the
ESN than
tension.
addressing the root causes of insecurity. The operation in Mother's Valley has become a
The
narrative turning
courtroom
point.
disruption remain unresolved in the minds of citizens when power appears one-sided,
in which Udele and his men
requires
allegedly targeted what they
facts,
described as criminal
not
or terrorist
assumptions.
The ambiguity
So,
of terminology in
what
this
do
context
you
is critical.
think?
What is crime
is-
fighting for someone's repression?
Drop your
force with
thoughts
community
in the
legitimacy for
comment
others?
section,
This duality has
but
fueled
keep it
polarization and complicated
respectful
attempts
and
to construct a
factual.
consensual narrative about the events. Supporters of the
If
ESN
election results are rejected before voting even begins,
They point to reports of decreased certain crimes in communities under ESN vigilance. Critics, however, warn that normalizing the
at a
presence of non-state
moment
armed
that
actors
could shape
establishes a
your
security pattern
future,
based on the law of the strongest,
and then
undermining
struggling
institutional
to
trust,
be
and
heard.
paving the way for abuses
For
and internal
Kanu's
rivalries. This tension manifests in everyday life. Markets operating under the shadow of armed militias, citizens negotiating passage with vigilantes instead of police,
This
fragmented
simply
reports circulating on
political
social media with
tension,
urgent warnings.
or
Among these
should there
narratives,
be
the
more
voice of ordinary
public
civilians,
clarification
majority
to
silenced by
calm
fear or lack of safe
concern?
platforms, is lost, replaced by polarized versions that reinforce pre-existing opinions rather than clarify facts.
But
Politically,
because
the situation
of
has sparked
who
intense
he
debate.
is,
Some Igbo leaders have called for greater dialogue with
pause.
the federal government to redefine
Let
security
that
strategies that
be
include communities more
recognized.
actively. Others warn
Not
of the dangers
because
of
of
legitimizing
rigging,
non-state armed groups,
not
recalling recent
because
history
of
where
violence.
militia proliferation ultimately overwhelmed pacification efforts. Academic and civil society analyses have emphasized the need to strengthen the rule of law, promote social inclusion, and address structural causes of insecurity rather than rely exclusively on militarized tactics. Experts caution that a purely coercive approach risks exacerbating resentment and perpetuating cycles of violence. Economic
Dress
marginalization, lack
before
of
the
job
court.
opportunities, weak judicial
For
institutions,
those who may
and
not
historical distrust of state
understand,
security forces
a
have been identified
final
as factors fueling persistent
these
insecurity.
were not
In this sense,
outside
the emergence of
rumors.
the ESN
They
and figures like Udele is
occurred
not the root
during
problem,
the
but a symptom of
session
a deeper
in
governance and
open
social
court.
cohesion crisis. Yet analyzing
Final
this phenomenon in structural
reflection.
terms should not diminish the concrete
Whether
human
you
consequences.
people
Families losing members
begin
in
to
clashes,
question
merchants
the
seeing their
idea
livelihoods destroyed,
of one
students abandoning
Nigeria,
schools out of fear.
not
These
because
testimonies reflect the silent tragedy accompanying prolonged conflict. The underlying question, who protects the ordinary citizen, remains central and resists
in
simplistic
any
answers.
democratic
Social media
society.
narratives add further complexity.
At the same
Often,
time,
the speed of image, video, and rumor dissemination surpasses verification capacity. This has led to misunderstandings, unfounded accusations, and in some cases, unnecessary panic. The sum in between verifiable facts, sourced from official statements or journalists on the ground, and amplified digital narratives remains one of the greatest challenges to collective understanding. Amid this flood of information and misinformation, the voices of international bodies, human rights organizations, independent observers, and aid agencies have emphasized the urgent need to protect civilians and document
according
human
to
rights
his
violations when they
legal
occur.
team,
Their message is clear.
Kanu was
Security
not
should be understood as
allowed to
enabling people to
deliver
live without
his
fear,
final
not as the
written
dominance of
ad-
one-armed actor over another. The subtle distinction significantly shapes how both the state and armed groups' actions are assessed. Udele's figure sits at the center of this narrative crossroads. For supporters, he symbolizes resistance against a perceived absent or negligent state. For critics, he is a component of a larger problem
indigenous
threatening to
peoples
perpetuate
of
violence and
Biafra.
erode institutional authority. History
What
will
happened
judge,
in
as it often
court?
does, but not without leaving a
Northern
profound mark on the collective
Nigeria
memory of those who lived
against
through these years of
foreign
tension.
strikes on
Institutional analysis
terrorist
demands consideration
targets.
of multiple factors.
Patterns
Nigerian state's role
ready,
in providing
you
security
can
and
see
justice,
the
the internal
tension.
dynamics of the ESN and other armed groups, intercommunity tensions,
The
communication,
courtroom
and propaganda
disruption
strategies during
remain
crises,
unresolved
and regional
in
and
the
federal
minds of
responses. None of these
citizens.
elements can be understood in
When
isolation.
power
They form a
appears
network shaping public
one-sided,
perception and the lived reality of
requires
millions in
facts,
southeastern Nigeria.
not
The central question,
assumptions.
transcending political
So,
preferences or
what
personal
do
loyalty,
you think
is whether armed interventions,
is-
whether state-led or not,
Drop your
can truly provide
thoughts
a
in the
sustainable path
comment
to stability.
section,
Contemporary
but
history
keep
offers
it
multiple examples where
respectful
militarization
and
without social
factual.
inclusion leads to repeated cycles of retaliation,
If
fear,
election
and community
results
fragmentation.
are
The alternative,
rejected
analysts argue,
before
is neither simple
voting
nor immediate.
even
It requires coordinated efforts integrating genuine dialogue, economic development, institutional strengthening, and full respect for human rights.
at a moment
Meanwhile,
that could
the lives of
shape your
ordinary people
future,
continue to be
and
marked by
then
uncertainty.
struggling
Each
to
dawn
be
brings the same
heard.
question. Will today
For
be safe?
Kanu's
This query, trivial in many parts of the world, carries the weight of a life permeated by insecurity for southeastern Nigerians. It is not about abstract numbers, but individual
this
stories.
simply
Mothers
political
seeking food for their
tension,
children, use longing
or
for
should
education.
there be
Elders
more
recalling less
public
turbulent times.
clarification
This
to
documentary does
calm
not seek to glorify
concern?
any actor or simplify a complex reality. Rather, it aims to illuminate the multiple dimensions of a conflict affecting
But
real human beings.
because of
The figure of
who
Udele,
he
the operations of
is,
Mother's Valley, the state's response,
pause.
and the civilians' outcry are
Let
part of a broader
that
narrative about the
be
pursuit of security,
recognized.
justice, and social cohesion
Not
in a region
because
that has
of
endured
rigging,
too much pain. The voices of
not
those calling for
because
peace
of
deserve careful
violence.
listening, not to be consumed by polarizing narratives that reduce them to extremes. Lasting peace, the kind that is not merely the absence of violence, but the presence of conditions allowing people to thrive with dignity, can only be achieved by addressing the root causes of insecurity, strengthening institutions, and rebuilding trust between the state and the communities it serves. As this story concludes, viewers are invited to continue
before
following
the
developments,
court.
question simplistic narratives,
For those who may
discern
not
verified facts from rumors,
understand,
and maintain a focus on
final
protection of human life.
these
Southeastern
were not
Nigeria's story is still
outside
unfolding,
rumors.
a narrative that
They
will continue to find
occurred
itself in the months
during
and
the
years ahead.
session in
And
open
as with any significant human story, its outcome will
final
depend on collective decisions
reflection.
made today, and above
Whether
all,
you
on the willingness to build a
people
future where
begin
security and
to
dignity are tangible
question the
rights for all.
idea